to our webinar. I just want to give some quick housekeeping stuff that if you do have any issues with sound or video quality, you can always, if you're connected to a VPN, it does sometimes slow you down. Use the question and answer box in the bottom right-hand corner. That's where we'll be taking questions, and I'll try to answer them throughout. My trusty partner, Kim LaFrancois, couldn't be here today. Otherwise, she would do some of this intro stuff. So I'll just say, type some questions in if you need any help. And there will be an on-demand version of the recording of this webinar sent out via email if you register today. So without further ado, I will move on into the meat of this, but we're going to talk about the IT and telecom supplier push for EcoVadis scores and specifically how to boost your score. So we're going to go into some detail about specifics. I am Adam Hammis. I am the ESG Director of Technical Business Development for SGS in North America. I run our sustainability assurance team, and I've got a long history on the client side as well, about 20 years in the industry. Happy to share more. But what we're really interested in talking today is briefly, who is SGS if you don't know, but what are the 5 North American drivers for IT and telecom companies specifically around ESG and sustainability? What is the EcoVadis ICT sector initiative and the impacts it's having in the marketplace? What is EcoVadis itself as a platform and the scoring? And then how do you improve that score? And then some additional resources, any Q&A you have along the way. Like I said, we'll type it into the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner. If you don't know who SGS is, we've been in business for over 100 years. We're the #1 world leader in testing, inspection, and certification with almost 100,000 employees around the world. I'd like to say boots on the ground around the world. We have a long-standing, well, first I'll say this, where sustainability as a core value is embedded within the company from the board, C-suite, all the way down to the front line, as well as almost 30 years now of experience in sustainability, where we sit on a lot of the working groups that create the standards. We give comments and feedback, and we often become a verifier, a certifier, or assurer for that standard itself. And we're proud to be recognized year after year in all of rating agencies that our clients often are dealing with. We do them all because we're a large publicly traded company, and we get very, very good scores and industry leading scores ourselves. So we know what we're talking about when we share. And the very first thing we like to give, not just what's great about SGS, but what's really important is your company, your situation, whatever role you're in. We would never tell you to adopt anything off the shelf. And what's really important is to understand your needs, what's material to your business. One very easy question is to just ask yourself, do you publish an annual ESG or sustainability report? That's a great threshold. It might take a couple of years the first time to really put a system in place. But once you've gone through that process, it really marks that you've identified a lot, you've taken a lot of steps, identified data, collected that data, and then put it into a publishable storytelling format that is very valuable. So we've been doing this for a very long time. We're actually the first in our industry to have an integrated report, which is our non-financials, environmental and social, alongside our financials. So you can go to our website and check that out. It's obviously, it takes time to mature to that level, but just recommend that everyone take a moment, ask yourself, do you publish a report? Because it's going to tell you where you're at in this position, and it's going to make it easier or harder for you to submit to things like EcoVadis as a platform. They're not the only platform. So I'll give you a few more seconds and then say mostly no's. You know, I'm a yes, but this is good. It's really important to know that if you're going to check out EcoVadis, it might actually be a really great starting point to provide structure. If you don't have that structure already, I would say, again, it's better to have your own customized to your business, what's material to your business approach. But if you want to get started quickly, some people do adopt things like EcoVadis, but I would say don't just rely on it fully. Luke Thomas, certificate or attendance roster available? There will be I don't believe so. Mona can answer this too, but it's not a formal training, so not a certificate of attendance, and we don't give out the email list specifically. But Mona, I know there might be names. Mona is our admin, so I'll let her answer that. Great question. The what are the drivers? So for IT and telecom, let's talk about what's happening in the industry. We're focused here on, North America, Canada, and the US, but there are some other things to consider. Really, the number one driver is regulation, and it's mostly around greenhouse gas. At this point in time, the vast majority is all greenhouse gas related climate disclosures. So in Canada, they just had the IFRS, or the ISSB sometimes, S2 climate disclosure standard that came out. That's going to be interpreted as the CSDS by the Canadian provincial government, but it is available already. I highly recommend checking that out, and it's effective as of the 1st of this year. There's obviously already, industrial federal suppliers. These are not probably going to apply to you, but there's something to consider is the B15 regulation in Canada, which is for the federally regulated financial institutions. So if you're banking with or insured by one of these large federally regulated institutions, you're going to have to, as a client of theirs, also disclose greenhouse gas data. And US is very similar. It mirrors it almost exactly, except for there's an additional California rule where IFRS doesn't apply. USA is a GAAP accounting country, one of the few left, and California went above and beyond that, and they did SB 253 and 261. So that's for $500 million revenue companies doing business in California, or if you're doing $1 billion, you have stepped up an additional reporting as well as assurance. The SEC climate rule, which is going to be negotiated in court, but is going to have all publicly traded companies of varying sizes stair-step into climate disclosures. But then you also have the industrial program, the GHGRP. We have a proposed only, it's not confirmed yet, but it's a proposed federal supplier rule that will impact far more companies than the Canadian federal supplier rule. And the FDIC guidance that we have is very similar to the banking guidance in Canada, where the largest banks are going to have to start measuring climate risk, which means that they have to use the people that they lend money to and what is their climate footprint. So greenhouse gas by far, but if you do business outside of the US and Canada, internationally at all, you're going to be impacted by larger sustainability or ESG regulations. And the big ones right now are, the global IFRS S1 is the general sustainability disclosure. It goes hand in hand with S2. So all countries around the world using IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, are going to be beholden to this, as well as the European Union. CSRD is kind of the central one, but there are other regulatory schemes rolling off of it. But CSRD is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and it has much broader impacts than greenhouse gas. So drivers, number one is definitely regulation, focus on greenhouse gas. And then you've got public ESG ratings. Now this is kind of twofold. We'll talk about the second part of it, but publicly traded companies have been dealing this for the last 10 years easily. You didn't have a choice. If you were publicly traded, there were groups that were scraping your data and giving you a rating. Now, the big ones that most people know of that have stood the test of time and have market credibility are the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. There's about 7,500 companies getting scored by them. MSCI ESG platform used to be Morgan Stanley. They actually sold it recently to be independent, but they have 8,500. ISS ESG, the Institutional Shareholder Services ESG platform, they have 11,500 being scored. And the big one that started later, but was fully dedicated to ESG, whereas the other one sort of expanded into ESG. Sustainalytics has 20,000 and counting. So majority of publicly traded companies, especially the big ones, have a score, whether they like it or not. And that has been, in fact, impacting them because investors and creditors have been using those scores for some time to make buy, sell, and lend decisions. But what if you're not publicly traded? That brings us to the number 3 driver, and what I like to call the second wave of sustainability kind of rippling across the globe. It's customer requirements. So the publicly traded companies that do have large brands are increasingly under pressure to improve not just their own impacts. In climate, it's called Scope 1 and Scope 2 initiatives, but just in general, you've got your operations, but you've got a huge impact in your supply chain, or I should say value chain, upstream and downstream. And these global brands have started asking now their suppliers to say, the only way for me to have transparency and manage my supply chain impacts is for you to report, and then I can roll up all that information and report it up to someone else. So that ESG data comes in really, there's a myriad of forms, but I'll tell you two very popular and very quickly growing platforms are CDP, mostly on the climate side. They have 18,700 reporters, and then EcoVadis, and that's not just greenhouse gas. CDP is the climate version, is just the greenhouse gas disclosures, but EcoVadis is broad sustainability reporting in multiple categories, and they have over 100,000. Why is that? Because EcoVadis and CDP both have two different programs. CDP is called the Supply Chain Member Program, where 317 brands total around the world, 50 of those being in the IT and telecom sector, which is the largest sector of their supply chain membership program, have publicly committed to asking all of their suppliers to report in CDP its climate-related data, so they can roll that up and manage their footprint. Where in EcoVadis, they have something called sector initiative brands. They have sector initiatives, and then there are individual brands that make up those initiatives. They collaborate. There are over 1,000 sector initiative brands within different sectors participating. There are 53 companies in the IT and telecom sector. It's the second largest sector for initiatives under EcoVadis. So a huge component of this is that large companies that are publicly traded are publicly committing to requesting, and sometimes feels like a soft mandate sometimes, to their supply chain and saying, we would like you very much to report to this platform. And that's hitting a huge number of small, medium-sized, privately held companies, which is vastly different from a volume standpoint than the smaller amount of large publicly traded companies. There are other drivers on definitely, direct to consumer, if you want to talk about the consumer demand, but also employees, like talent management. Those are much lower on the poll of how much pressure they're putting on for a business driver. But just in case, I don't want to leave those out, there is a whole consumer pressure and employee pressure to perform in sustainability categories. So here's an example. This is just a list of the CDP supply chain members that I mentioned. There are premium members, there are lead members, and there are standard members, but you can recognize all of these companies quite well. And then we'll spend a huge chunk of this webinar talking about the ICT EcoVadis initiative. We do actually have a CDP climate workshop it's a 4-hour technical workshop for helping people boost their score. So if you're ever interested, I just highly recommend it. We have a technical specialty in that. Sorry, it's not there. I think it's June 11th. I'm not sure why I didn't update that date, but it will be updated before I send out the slide deck. Oh, here's the consumer I mentioned. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but consumers and employees are a huge, huge chunk for some companies, but not all. What is your organization's #1 business driver for reporting sustainability data? Again, I don't want you to take SGS's position. I want you to think about your own company, because that's what's going to determine whether you want to do EcoVadis and to what extent, because there are lots of levels to participate in. But if it's regulatory, that's very common. Public ESG ratings, supply chain customers that are sending you requests, or do you have direct facing consumer pressure, employees, or other? If you do want to have an other, I just ask you, it'd be great to hear that, put it in the Q&A box and tell us what that other driver is for your business. We'd love to hear, but I'll give it a few moments. I'll tell you from SGS's side, we are a publicly traded company. We're global. So ESG ratings has driven it, absolutely. But I would almost say customers, but not supply chain customers. We serve just the nature of who we are as an assurance provider. We've always been in that space, and as sustainability has kicked off and over the decades, just third-party assurance has always been important to prevent and manage greenwashing claims, or claims against company that they are greenwashing. It's not that you won't have multiple of these drivers. Also, I just want to put it out there, you probably have a mix, but it's good to know what your #1 driver is, and then #2, #3, and that's how you're going to build a program and approach things like EcoVadis strategically for your company, because you want it to add business value, not just to be a bolt-on extra work and a vacuumous, place where you throw cash. But these things can be really valuable business tools that add value if you approach them strategically. Regulation, so this is not a surprise. It fits very well. I'm glad we have some consumers here, some consumer-facing companies. And those supply chain customers, if that's not your number one driver, it might be increasing over time. So I just say that if you haven't gotten surveys or requests yet, you probably will from the likes of CDP and EcoVadis. So what is the EcoVadis ICT sector initiative? It's one of many sector initiatives, but it's specific. So let's talk about it. So EcoVadis itself is the youngest and largest ESG rating agency that exists, but it's growing the most rapidly and at an increasing rate. So if you put it on this little chart of the others that I showed, CDP is the outlier here. It's not an ESG reporting or rating agency. It's purely a climate rating agency. But you can see from the numbers, EcoVadis was founded the latest in 2007 and has by far the most reported companies. It's because of these sector initiatives. When people put in a request, they might have 100 or 1,000 suppliers joining at one time because one company or one brand requested to their entire supply chain to report through it. So it's going to continue to increase just for that. And it reaches more people because climate it's very high on everyone's list, but there are far more social and environmental issues under the EcoVadis banner because it's a broad reporting platform. So there's more opportunity to catch people for whatever their reporting needs are. So then you have these sector initiatives, and specifically ICT is the internet telecommunications. It's communications and telecom. They have a different word for it, but I think it's just not that important. But it's the sector initiatives for IT and telecom companies. Now, as you can see here, it's actually a combination of individual brands: Liberty Global, Nokia, Orange, Tele2, Telenor, Deutsche Telekom, and Verizon. But the 45-member alliance of the procurement, the buy-in alliance, all their members are also a part of it. So they collaborate together. Their mission is to drive improvement in the information and communications technology supply chain. There it is. I just needed to read my own slide. But that's their mission. So all they're trying to do, and if you think about it, it dovetails well with the SASB standards, which we could talk about if you have more questions. But essentially, a lot of these standards were that exist internationally around the world that tell you if you're in this industry, report these metrics. That's really good guidance, but some people say, well, you created these standards with input from industry, but it was maybe a small number of global large corporations, and it didn't maybe fit well with some of this next wave of small, medium-sized companies. So they're trying to drive improvement in the supply chain, and one of the ways they do that is to aggregate larger amounts of data from more diverse companies in the industry so that they can give that feedback to folks like the SASB standards and improve, update, and change what's being required and what is realistically should be expected from a reporting standpoint for entire industries and entire sectors. So that's the intent of all of these. And for the ICT, that's the IT and telecom industry specifically. If you look at what's happening, the rate of just in this sector, the rate of growth is very large and very fast. I think they're up closing on 3,000 reporters when they were just over 1,000 back in 2019. So it's very, very rapid growth, not just across EcoVadis, but in this sector of reporting companies, and it's going to continue to grow. The other impacts are that it's just global, worldwide. This is not only a North American thing, but what you're seeing is not only are people getting on it, which is required, but 81% of reporters in the ICT sector have improved their scores since their first assessment. So this is ICT. It's really across the globe, and it is creating and leading to improvement in performance on the vast majority of companies. And a lot of that, 19% are probably some of the first year assessments. And so it's good to see that it's not just reporting for reporting's sake, it's identifying opportunities. So here's the comparison. Again, I'm focused on North America, but if you look at ICT overall, you can actually see like the orange bar is North America, Canada, and the US. But you've got a large European, and this is probably coming from CSRD and other pressures, but then you see Asia Pacific is also growing, Africa and the Middle East. It's all on the rise year over year. And North America is a good chunk of that, but we are second usually to Europe. So what are the future impacts? I've mentioned it briefly, but if you think about the standards that are being used Everything on the bottom of this chart are really not as, they're not as common, they're not being adopted by the business community as aggressively because they're really in the sustainability phase, or what's called impact materiality. They often will call it double materiality. CSRD is pushing a double materiality framework. So it's really about how the businesses have a positive or negative impact on society and the planet. But everything on the top line is investor driven, and it's being adopted far more rapidly because it's purely what do the social and environmental issues have as an impact on the company's bottom line. So it's the financial materiality. It's still very valuable, but as like a fundamental financial metric and almost like a risk management, whereas sustainability is adding all of the feel good, good for the planet, good for society type of initiatives, but are not being, just honestly not being adopted as fast because the business case is harder to make for those. That lets you say like, okay, I can put my focus, especially if I'm starting from a business standpoint, on integrated reporting. That's the IR, SASB, TCFD. All these standards are investor driven and have since combined once about 3 to 5 years ago in the Values Reporting Foundation. And last year, they're actually absorbed into IFRS by the ISSB. Sorry for all the acronyms, but the simplicity of they rolled out the SASB standards did not get changed. There's like 77 industry specific standards that still exist. But all of that's being kind of absorbed and spit back out into this called the S1 and S2 standard that I mentioned earlier. And they are the best place to go if you want to save yourself time and energy. They have taken all of integrated reporting, SASB, TCFD, and not only kind of taken the best of it, combined it, and then built on it. And so in one place, if you want to follow S1 and S2 from the IFRS Foundation, you will be aligning with and also following TCFD, SASB, integrated reporting as well. So they have all the same principles built in. So that's just to say that's where the future impacts are. The reason everyone's wanting simplification, alignment across regions and across standards, so it's easier for reporting companies to do things like report to EcoVadis, and EcoVadis is participating. Their platform has just went through a redo. As the standards get more aligned, the platforms like EcoVadis, they follow in turn, and they try to make their platforms so that more aligned, so you don't have to do different types of reporting on their platform versus somewhere else in the region or in the industry. So the overall goal of the entire movement is to simplify things and make it easier for companies to report the data that is material to their business. And that's just that's another future impact of not only what EcoVadis is doing, but these sector initiatives are going to power a lot of that change and a lot of the right sizing of information by just bringing copious amounts of data that was not available before and aggregating it to inform these standards. That was a lot, but so the simple question is, has your organization received an EcoVadis survey request from a customer? We'd like you to report. It's very simple. Yes, we send and we have received, but we've been doing EcoVadis for a long time, so I'll say SGS is as yes. But you might not do EcoVadis. You might have received a different platform where you've been requested by a customer and they want you to put it in some other, lesser known or more specific platform. That's great too. If you do that, we'd love to hear about it in the Q&A box. And then just know, you might not have received a single one. You might not be the person who hears about it from your organization as well. Sometimes it's good to ask around. Those sometimes go to compliance people or maybe government relations, investor relations. Supply chain is a big component. So if you're a supply chain manager, or if you have a supply chain manager in the company, they might be the one who received it, because EcoVadis really started off as a supply chain management tool from the outset. It's kind of grown and matured since then into a broader rating agency, but give it a few more seconds and then hit yes. All right, so the vast majority here, yes, you've already received one. Somebody says not EcoVadis, but a different one. If you want to put it in the Q&A, we'd love to hear. I can tell you like SAQ is popular with the automotive industry, just as an example. And then still some that have received a no. That's totally valid. But it's really good to know Sometimes you'll receive 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how many customers you serve and how big they are. So let's talk about the platform. If you know you're going to report, if you're now interested in reporting, what is it? What do you need to know? And so this is what we're going to talk about, just your score and what the methodology is, how your score is built so that you know how to make a difference. But there are essentially 4 themes. So your entire score, your overall score, is broken into 4 essentially ESG subscores that get aggregated into your overall score. It lines up with ESG, but they say environment. Instead of social, they say labor and human rights. And instead of governance, they say ethics. But I promise you, they're all very much aligned. And then they have an additional score, which is why EcoVadis exists in the first place. It was all about supply chain management. And so they call that sustainable procurement. But it's really about all of your value chain efforts and tracking. And so it's a separate score in and of itself. The other 3 are directly for your operations. And then those get aggregated up into your, in this case, you're looking at SGS's a couple of years ago, sort of showing you, aggregates, composite score of 72, but it's made up of these 4. What that actually means, so all of these 4 sub-themes are made up of different scored topics. And so as you see under environment, this is the entire ecosystem for how EcoVadis works. These are the only topics that you're scored on, that any company is scored under at all, but this is the entire menu. We'll get a little more specific here in a second, but they have what's called their 21 CSR criteria. And each of the 4 themes has specific topics, and each one of those has scoring criteria in them. So I'll give you a second to just kind of soak it all in, but this is the entirety of what you're scored on within the EcoVadis system. Now, then, for making it more useful, each theme and your overall score, they want to compare you against your peers, so they put you in an EcoVadis industry group. That is just an apples to apples, so that you can have the same weighting and the same topics, and you're not comparing like a telecom company to a convenience store. It just doesn't make sense. And so you can see SGS here, and if you look down here on the actual group, there's always an industry listing. We are architectural and engineering activities. But then you will also be given what's called a theme score distribution, where your line shows up. It shows the entire industry group that you're within, and you can see whether you're in the top half, bottom half, whatever. Are you a good performer, bad performer? And then you have badges. So the score is numerical, and that's not going to change. But you have, from basically a marketing perspective, a badge for top percentile. So you could have a really low score, but if your entire industry is performing poorly according to this EcoVadis platform, you still might be in the upper percentile of just your group of IT and telecom companies. So what they provide is this rating, and that's helpful, mostly from a marketing position and a market position. But it's the top 1% gets into platinum, top 5% gets into gold, top 15% gets into silver, top 35% gets into bronze. And again, that's purely based on your industry for a badge. We'll come back to that. But your actual score and your number is how you fit just against the entire 0 from 100 rating system. Keith says, we were asked to do EcoVadis for customer, but we were never told our scores. Is there a way we can find out how we scored? Keith, yes. You should receive an email, and it should come directly from EcoVadis, and it should be announcing when your scores come out. Those came out, they only come out usually on a 12-month rolling period. CDP is different. There's a very set schedule, but EcoVadis is whenever you sign in, you get on the platform and report. You have a 12-month window, and then you'll start getting reminders to submit. So check your email, but also somebody should be able to log into the ecovadis.com platform and have a user ID, and you can get access to all of your scores and why and the breakdown for it, which we'll go over a little bit here next. But you should be able to find that. It's both in your email or someone's email, and somebody in your company has to have a username and login for the system. Next is industry exclusion. So once you're put into a themed industry group, and so IT and telecom, for instance, they just exclude a bunch of the categories that do not matter, but are not as material to your specific industry and your group. So you can see things like biodiversity, also matter, but energy consumption and GHGs, water, some of those things will stick around. Social dialogue are more for like mining companies who have to go into communities where they're making huge impacts and do stakeholder engagement. And so there's things that they basically whittle down all of these and they make a custom profile, is what it's called, for your industry group. And that allows you to, again, focus, do less, but more important reporting and on material topics that are specific for your industry. So then once you get in there, you have a weightings, your industry group, each theme below it. We showed you the numbers up here, but there's a little 1, 2, 3, 4 dots. I believe they're actually rolling this out where it'll just actually say I think it'll just be 1, 2, 3, or 4 moving forward. But it's essentially, do you have a 25% rating, 50% rating, 100% rating? And those dots are how the theme itself, like environment, is only a 50% weighting to this composite score of 72, whereas labor and human rights for us was 100% into the aggregate score for the total. So it's just a simple number out of 4, but it's a percentile, 25, 50, 75, 100, and that tells you how you get your math for this overall composite score. So again, they're trying to make it all very specific to your industry. And then you have disclosure weightings. Disclosures are by type in policies, actions, and results. And one of my comments and I guess feedback, which it's criticism, is that actions are the highest weighted type of disclosure, whereas results are 35%. I would say that results should be the highest weighted, where policies, actions, the intent of all of it is actually to lead to results, but they do give you a little bit of a grace and say, hey, we know that it takes time, and their rationale is that policies come first, actions come second, and results come later. So it's a smart, wise, kind of dip your toe in and then make progress over time approach. And then each of those disclosure types breaks down into smaller sub-disclosure types. I put them here, but policies is actually, do you have policies, and do you have any endorsements? Did you sign up, or are you a member of a group, or did you endorse some sort of pledge? That's why they're not that big of a deal, but they do put your feet to the fire a little bit. Measures, certifications, and coverage are very much actions related. So they are somewhat of the results, but they're not reported, and they don't necessarily have any assurance behind them. So how are you measuring things? Have you been third-party certified to any particular standard? And then the coverage as a multiplier, is that only 70% of your buildings or facilities, or is that 20% of your facilities? So that multiplier of coverage will change this dramatically. And then reporting is, what do you publicly report and disclose on? And then this 360 Watch is actually an AI generating news tool that follows current events. And if you've been in the news for positive or negative things related to these different topics, it will ding you, and they'll stay on file for a certain number of years until they grandfather out. So it does look at a lot of different things. And then last, your industry group average. This is kind of simple, but they put a little black line so that you can see where you are on the industry average and say, okay, are we above average, below average? So that's just what this little line means when you're reading your reports. So one thing that we tell people is if you're far above average, even if your score is high, if you're way above even if your score is low, if you're way above the industry average, it might be better use of your time to go somewhere where your score seems high, but the industry average is also high. So you just want to be better than your peers for the most part. That means you're doing very well. And that's something to really look at when you're deciding what to do next. And then people ask, well, what's more important, badges or points? So there's not really a right answer, but as we said, badges are achieved as a percentage of your industry group from a marketing perspective, and wanting to just know that you're a leader in this realm. If you don't know that 100, you're not striving to necessarily ace the test that EcoVadis has created and whatever their algorithm is. Badges are very, very important, mostly because they tell you how you're doing against your competitors. And so it is marketable as well. You can put that badge on your website, on your products, And so that is very useful in that sense. But the difference is you can control your point totals. And it's very important from a strategic, just operational standpoint that you try to maintain and improve your points because you can control it. You cannot control your badge because the reality is you may make a few improvements, but 17 other industry peers might make significant investments and you might drop out of the 1%, drop out of the 5%, and not have the same badge, but you still improved your point total. And that's a reality that's possible because of what the difference is between a badge and a point total. So I would say operationally, control your points and measure that. Be interested in, understand where the thresholds are, but know that those change. Those are moving targets. So it's really hard to guarantee yourself that you're gonna earn a badge or keep a badge because you can't control what your peers are doing. So it's better to keep improving consistently over time, just as a path to success. And then people often ask us, well, what is this going to be used for? Who cares if I have a bad score? Well, we can't tell you what every company itself is going to do, but there is plenty of research and that shows this is how companies generally use this information when you're doing supply chain management, and it's no different. Don't expect your EcoVadis score to be the only determining factor, but it's going to be put into the larger mix of factors, and customers always do it in a particular manner where they don't want to take a lot of risk. So first, they'll just have a request for disclosure. At some point, that might become a demand or a mandate for disclosure and saying, hey, if you don't disclose, we're just not going to work with you. But literally, you can do the bare minimum to disclose, and disclosure is the first step. Then, before they'll use a stick, they often use a carrot and say, because this allows them to keep all of their supply chain members intact and not lose business partners. But they'll put an incentive at the higher level and say, anyone achieving above this score, whatever that happens to be, you get preferred vendor status, or it might be, your EcoVadis goes into a composite score that gives you preferred vendor status, but they want to incentivize good performance first, again, because you're not losing any suppliers, which is difficult for any brand to deal with. And last, but it does happen, is at a certain point, as they start to see more and more vendors in the system, seeing improvement, if there are very poor performers, they will put a floor. And they'll say, hey, you know what? We've done this long enough. It's been 5 or 10 years. We have a minimum level performance. If you can't get above a D in EcoVadis, for instance, we're just not going to do business with you. And they might give you a performance plan and say you've got a year or 2 years to change. But that is almost always the last thing that happens, because they can get a lot more, you can get a lot more bees with honey, as they say, because they can stair step it in. They know it takes time for these small and medium-sized companies, but you can't expect over time, if you do nothing, you might be on the chopping block, and you certainly are going to miss out on any incentivized preferred vendor statuses if they're asking you to start reporting this data. So just generally know that that's the pathway for responsible supply chain management, and we don't expect it to be any different. So what is your organization's current EcoVadis score? If you have one, you could say don't have a score yet. I'll tell you, in full transparency, we were platinum, but now this year I have to say gold, because we maybe we got complacent, but something shifted and we went from platinum to gold. We still had improvements in our overall score, but we're now looking at being more aggressive and getting back to platinum, because we were at that level and we really like it. But you might not have a score yet. It's possible to be scored but not have a badge. And that's because of the level, like you might have been doing the bare minimum and saying, we just didn't earn a badge, and or we have just started scoring, we haven't got our official score back. So you could say there's kind of 2 ways to be in that category. But bronze, again, it's the 35%, like top 35%, silver's the top 15%, gold's the top 5%, platinum is the top 1%. So I'll give everybody a moment or 2 left to just put in your scores, but it's good to know also not only what you do have now, but are you setting a target for the future? And again, it might not be badge related. We would actually always recommend that you start with points related, and then see if you want, if you can get the badge, that's obviously great. A lot of people do not have a score yet, or scored but no badge, and then some silver. So congratulations to the silvers. That's still really good, top 15% in your industry. My hat is off to you. And there's plenty of opportunities to boost your score if you understand how the methodology works. So something just jumped really fast. There we go. How to improve EcoVadis scores. So how do you do this? So we're going to take a little quick step back and just say there is chasing points. And if anyone's ever familiar with like LEED certification with buildings, it's a huge conversation of, do you chase points or do you make the best building? You can do both, but I'm going to basically talk about make the best building. So your organization can chase EcoVadis points, and it is worthwhile, but you also simultaneously should really have a strategic approach that matches your company. And that way you know where to put your attention within EcoVadis, because EcoVadis doesn't know your business. It knows a lot of generalizations about the industries that it serves, but your business is special, and you should really figure out what's material to you, prioritize. How do companies do that? They go through a 5-step cycle, and that typically, once you get into reporting and actually have an annual report, this becomes an annual cycle. But the first time you go through it, it could take a couple years. But it's really awareness, which means, do you understand all the issues, trends, strategies, regulations, standards, frameworks, rating agencies? You really want to do your own education internally first, and then you prioritize once you know something about your company and all of the expectations. And how companies prioritize is usually called a materiality assessment, their stakeholder engagement. But you use various tools to identify both the risks, but also the opportunities for your company. And those are both very important to balance. And once you prioritize, then you can create a strategy. You start building out visions, KPIs, goals, and plans, assigning leadership to actually perform in the priority areas or the material topics that you have identified. And then you go into execution. This is just day-to-day implementation of these ESG sustainability initiatives, projects, quality, risk management, all those things that a typical business as usual would need to have. And then you get into reporting. What and to whom are you going to communicate your progress, your storytelling? Often there's 2 parts to it: how you're managing these material topics, and then how you're performing over time. So what are those KPIs, and how has that performance looked compared to the year before, and then you cycle back through. The maturity, every time you go through a full cycle, you get more mature, you get better at executing, better at reporting, better at understanding, more confidence in your strategy. And then the reason it's in the sequence is it really mitigates risk. Those first 3 stages are done by internal leadership, often senior level, and then execution. By that time later, you're going to have these internal stakeholders and business partners seeing you do something different. But you have a lot of opportunity in those first 3 phases to do kind of behind closed doors, have uncomfortable conversations about excluding something that you might really care about, but it's just not going to be a priority for your company for whatever reason. And sometimes it's better to have those conversations in private. And then when you can finally execute and you can start to communicate in the reporting phase, you have a story to tell about what you are able to do and why these are your priorities and why other things are not your priorities. But it does help you sequence it and mitigate risk. And then who is actually completing these is very role-based. First is usually the strategy, and it's a senior ESG committee of some kind. It has to be high-level leadership, often with board oversight, and that's just because they have the only ones who can determine what's material for the company have the highest view of leadership in the company. You can't have a middle manager tell you what your plan is and what's material to the business, because they only have a limited viewpoint. So it's always a committee, and it's always senior level. When you go into execution, well, I'll back up and give you an example. Here is from the public reports. These are very public, and I link out to them. But Verizon, for instance, they have an entire section on governance, how they govern, what the structure is, and the different committees that exist for managing their ESG program. They also have their prioritization, how they prioritize different topics, what's the process that they went through, soliciting feedback and stakeholder engagement. And then they also report on, here are our issues, here's our priorities, both socially and environmentally, and then here's how we're going to manage those moving forward. So every company essentially gets into this and has to complete this. It's an essential part: governance, prioritization, and strategy. What we would say, if you're going to prioritize the same thing, once you have that central theme for the company, you have an ESG governance committee or a sustainability governance committee, then you can start diving into specific things like EcoVadis to make sure you're spending your time wisely. So this is a tool that we use in our 4-hour workshop. Basically, it has the 4 themes: environment, labor, human rights, ethics, and sustainable procurement down the side. You put your theme score, like what did you actually score? What's the theme weighting? And are you above or below average? And then you choose, am I going to start focused on environment, labor and human rights, ethics, because you can't improve everything at once, and you need to go in order. So if environment is number 1, spend your time on environment, get really good at it. And then if there's time, move on to labor and human rights if that's number 2, for instance. But you cannot and should not try to do everything and change the whole company at once. It is very unrealistic and problematic. And so here's an example of just, this is a sample to show you why would somebody choose, labor and human rights? Well, because it's not their lowest score, but they're slightly above average. And maybe they just decided, hey, we've done a lot on environmental, which is something we've done. At SGS, we said, we've taken environmental a lot of the way. We're kind of stuck on basically scope 3 emissions. Not stuck on them, but we're stuck on setting a science-based target because we're trying to get certain controls under place. So we chose to put labor and human rights because we ship people all over the world on planes, trains, and automobiles, and auditors and assessors, and health and safety for them and their protection is number 1. So even though it was, slightly higher in score, we chose it as the number 1. Then we said we would keep working on environment, and we switched to these, 3rd and 4th because, they're just not weighted the same. Sustainable procurement for us is very low weighting, so it's number 4. But you want to really make a strategic decision on where you're going to spend your time before you even dive into all of the scoring. And we help people do that on a regular basis. This is an example of roadmap improvements. We highly recommend that you take what EcoVadis gives you, but then build a roadmap. So for instance, we'll have every sheet and every rating that they give us an improvement area. We'll have a quick win column, a short-term projects column, a medium-term projects column, and a long-term projects column, so that we basically have a 5-year plan and beyond if necessary. And then we can send leadership. This is like, it's good for getting approvals. It's like anything that was a quick win, we'll prioritize it and put it on a 1-pager, or it's actually 2 pages by theme, and say, hey, we've got 26 quick wins, but we also have some really good short-term projects, and we can batch them all together and present them on what we're going to do next. So approaching it in this very systematic way is the best way to improve your score, because you can just go after the things that cause you not only the most risk, but have the highest rating based on all the methodology that we showed you earlier. Okay, that's a bunch of stuff. What resources would help you take the next steps? Nothing, we're good. EcoVadis training, EcoVadis planning services, sustainability, ESG training, or just greenhouse gas specific training. We throw that in there, not because EcoVadis is focused on greenhouse gas, but because all the regulatory pressure right now, the vast majority of it is greenhouse gas training or greenhouse gas related. But if you have something other that you do need help with, we obviously, SGS doesn't do everything. So we're always happy to plug you into other resources, because we do work with global resources around the world. And we know that some people are really in the weeds on something specific. But if any of these other items might help, knowing what you now know about the ICT initiative through EcoVadis, and sort of the background, what we would say is chase points, yes, but don't make chasing EcoVadis points your entire strategy, because you're gonna miss some things, and it's not gonna be the absolute best thing for your company. That's why some of the broader sustainability and ESG training is really valuable. I would say for us, I would even put EcoVadis, not training. We give the training, but we have to be updated. They just rolled out a new update to their platform. And so as trainers ourselves, we go review it all. We're also users. So our corporate team is going through, which I'm a member of, and actually putting SGS through the new platform and making sure we know how to use it. for our own score. So I would probably put EcoVadis Training. That's what I clicked on. We're just in a slightly different category because we're a service provider. But I'll give everybody a few more seconds and remind you that we have the Q&A box as well. So nothing, we're good. EcoVadis Training. So what I like to see is it's a balance. And it reiterates to me, and hopefully you understand, like, nobody needs the exact same thing. Don't take off the shelf guidance. Make sure you're getting something specific that's material to your business, and take the next best step for you and your company. And if you have an other, which listed here, if you have something we think you can help us with, or if you have something you think we can help you with, and we don't do it, we will tell you, and we'll try to connect you with some other organizations. You can type that in the Q&A box if you want. So just really quick, I'll throw through here. Not only do we do the CDP workshop, it's a 4-hour technical workshop. We do the same thing with EcoVadis. We just dive in deep and basically go through all your scores with you and help you develop that roadmap. Sustainability assurance, if you're not familiar with it, this is giving you basically along your entire journey, all the different services that we provide and how they make sense. But sustainability assurance is, well, tangible benefits. Sometimes people do it just because it's a requirement. But really the number one thing is internal confidence in your own system. Your own investments and strategies are based on the data that you're using. If you're not sure the data is correct, then it's really important that you figure that out early. But then obviously people want to meet regulatory requirements. If you get assurance, third-party assurance, it improves your ESG ratings and scores across the board, but it's also external confidence for customers and stakeholders. But left to right here, if you think about your own, if you're early and then getting more and more advanced, first you start out with training, whether it's greenhouse gas or ESG training. We have a CDP climate workshops, EcoVadis workshop. But when you get into execution, you might need greenhouse gas accounting help or a CDP ratings boost. Or ESG materiality assessments are very, very common because you're trying to determine what your priority topics should be. And then we have the EcoVadis rating boost service. What's called pre-assurance is often named different things, or pre-verification. There's all kinds of naming for it, but a spot check essentially that is cheaper, faster, and usually 100% remote is a GHG gap analysis, which you don't need a certificate, but you can actually have someone who's qualified check your math, check your controls, check your KPI definitions, check your data collection systems, and give you a bunch of findings. We just don't close those findings with you and issue a certificate or a statement at the end. Same thing with pre-assurance. That's just a broader sustainability report assurance. Sometimes people do just limited to ESG, KPIs, but you can do full report assurance where you say, are we compliant with IFRS S1 and S2? That's a lot more assurance. That's checking the entire context of the report, not just the accuracy of the KPIs. And then you have limited versus reasonable assurance. Limited is always a smaller number or a lower threshold or a higher threshold for sampling, where you drop down. For instance, with greenhouse gas, it's really easy. If any scope category of emissions is 10% or more of total emissions in that scope, you have to sample that data and see source evidence like receipts, invoices, bills of lading, things like that. But if reasonable, it drops down to anything 5% or higher. That's the threshold. They lower the threshold, so more data has to be sampled to make sure it's accurate. I'll say we have great ESG trainings. They have full day courses. We have an on-demand video that leads into a strategy session, an execution, and a reporting session for those 3 different roles that we discussed. Those are coming up in June. We have great greenhouse gas training. We train our competitors. We train our own auditors who are lead verifiers, and we train people who are internal to their own teams for all the different standards. There's an introduction course, organizational footprints, project footprints, as well as a verification course, which is all 5 days. And then again, CDP. We have a huge library of free content. You will never watch it all. That's literally 100 plus videos with 100 plus hours of footage, a lot of technical trainings, technical webinars, things that if you get on there, I highly recommend checking out our YouTube channel. And we add stuff all the time. So follow us on SGS North America on YouTube, and I think you'll love it. The last thing I'll say is if you have any questions, I'll be quiet. I've been looking in the Q&A box, but type them in if you have them. I see one question, what new regulations are in the works that we should expect in the future? Not really. There's not a ton. In Europe, they're always coming out with more, but there's also legal pressure on trying to fine tune some of that stuff. The ones that you should really follow are whether the SEC ruling gets fully approved. It's going to have legal battles, but once it's fully approved and it goes into effect, all publicly traded companies need to be aware. But I would say less look at the banking and the financially regulated institution. Kind of they have huge ripple effects out into unseen sectors, because people are they're going to find out that their bank is going to require them to do this, or their insurance company is going to require them to do this, and it doesn't matter if they're publicly traded or not. So I would more definitely watch these supplier requests, but watch out for who you're banking with. And the new regulation is mostly centered around greenhouse gas. I'll just repeat that. It says, if there's one place to focus, what would you recommend first? I mean, there's two ways I could answer that. Topics, I would say greenhouse gas and climate disclosures, because that's the #1 regulated topic. But I would say whatever platform is requesting your disclosure. So if you're not publicly traded, but you're receiving a CDP request, just start with CDP. You're going to learn a lot. And then if you later get an EcoVadis request, then you can follow up. Just know that they are on the horizon. They're growing very rapidly. So if you haven't seen one yet, there's a high likelihood you will. But I would approach it from two different ways. Topic is definitely greenhouse gas, but if you want to make your customers happy and grow the business, then look at whoever is sending you these platform requests for disclosure. Great questions. Anything else? I can stay here for a few minutes. I don't have any other Q&A right now, or that I don't see. But thank you. I mean, I'll stay here and wait, but just want to thank everybody for the questions you've sent in. Thanks for taking your time today to sit with us and walk through all the content. I certainly hope if you're in the IT and telecom industry, you take a look and dive deeper into all of these, not only the sector initiatives, but what's being asked of you from the standards. You can always reach out to us, myself and my team. Kim is in charge of all of our sales. Sorry she wasn't able to be here today, but definitely we can have a call and talk to you about anything you're struggling with, any challenges you have. Like I said, if we can't do it, we often know people who can, and so we're a great first call to make, and we'd love to hear from you. So with that, if there's nothing else, because I haven't seen another Q&A come in, thank you for those, by the way. Mona, we could end it here, and then people can email us if they want. All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.